Hi, my name is Amber Crosse, and my research project is on an analysis of balance in individuals with Down syndrome. So, to jump right into it, my research question is, how does the strength of the soleus muscle affect fall risk and ability to balance? Specifically, when looking at individuals with Down syndrome, does the tightened soleus muscle weaken the amount of force exerted in ankle flexion? And then how does this affect fall risk in individuals with Down syndrome and their ability to conduct everyday tasks? So I did my internship at the ASU downtown campus. I worked in conjunction with the YMCA facilities, and I was a part of this really awesome program. It was called the Exercise and Wellness Program, and it specifically brought in people with Down syndrome so that you could create and cultivate a community so that people could work towards their health goals and overall help improve their quality of lives. So I worked with a lot of undergraduate students at the ASU downtown campus, and with them, I helped plan exercises for our workout buddies and helped get a better idea of what really meant to be a part of this program. So, some on-site memorable moments. I started in October to gain a familiarity with the workout buddies and get a better idea of what the program really means, get a better idea of what affects people with Down syndrome and what's the most prevalent issues going on. So, I had 13 participants in all. When I first started off, there were 13 participants, and then I ended up getting the pre-testing in for those 13 participants too when I started testing in my third trimester. So, I learned new ways to get individuals active and engaged. So I learned what affects people with Down syndrome the most, and that actually happened to be fall risks, sadly. I noticed within the first few months that I started doing my senior research project that it was difficult for them to go up and down the stairs without requiring assistance. So a lot of the individuals I worked with needed to hold on to the two sidebars, or they needed to completely be supported with their backs as they were going up the stairs. So because of this, it was all because of concern for fall risk, and I wanted to get a better idea of what's the reason behind why there is such an increased chance of falling for people with Down syndrome. Why do they need that increased assistance, and what might be the reason behind it? And so just a little insight as to why I chose this as my research project. Over the summer of 2019, I got to learn a little bit more about a physical therapy group in which they only worked with kids with disabilities. And so they brought in kids with cerebral palsy, Down syndrome, and autism, and they helped teach them new exercises, new stretches, new ways in which they could get their body moving and functioning, and so that they could develop properly all of their muscles. Especially when it comes to Down syndrome and cerebral palsy, it really affects the way in which your muscles are developing and overall your health in general. And so that really got me interested in learning a little bit more about how people with disabilities really aren't incentivized, and it's a lot harder for them to find a place in which they can feel comfortable to work out with and just overall help improve their health. Because there's been some studies, and this is why the physical therapy group in which I learned, there's been some studies and interest on learning how exercise can actually slow the progression of a lot of diseases, especially like cerebral palsy. And so that's why I got interested into something like this program, learning a little bit more about disabilities and how it affects people and exercise itself. So some project highlights. I did some isokinetic dynamometer testing and also the force platform balance assessment. So my background research. So I learned that muscle growth in children with Down syndrome is a lot much more slowed in comparison to children without Down syndrome. So this causes decreased tone and flexibility, and overall decreases the amount of activity and energy they're exerting as their kids. This affects their health, and it affects the trends in which they're going to be using as they become early adults. So that's obviously a prevalent issue when it comes to health of people with Down syndrome. Another research study showed that lab mice with Down syndrome have weakened muscles. However, it also showed that they have the same amount of muscle fibers as lab mice without Down syndrome. So it shows that they both have type 1 and type 2X, but it hints towards an idea of what might be being the reason behind the weakened muscle fibers. So just to be a little bit more specific, when you think about people with Down syndrome, people with Down syndrome tend to have much more flexible, much more easily stretchable limbs and ligaments and joints. And so because of that, people that I worked with were able to easily jump up into a split and with no ease, whereas I still can't do that. And so not all muscles with people in Down syndrome are very unflexible and very tightened. Rather, there's just one in particular that is very tightened and not as flexible and a lot more weakened. So that's the soleus muscle. So the soleus muscle is within your calf muscle. It is right below the big chunky one, which is called the gastrocnemius, and it attaches, it's more closer to the bone in your calf muscle, and it's attached to your ankle. And so it's a thing that's going to be helping you move your foot up and down. So the weakened soleus muscle is not caused because the fibers are weaker. Rather, it alludes to a slowed neuromuscular feedback, which is the cause behind the tensor soleus muscle, which just means that the nerves aren't communicating as fast as they should be in comparison to all the other muscles within the body. And so that's why it's a lot slower and harder for them to move, and it just seems a lot more tightened. So some more background research, balance in individuals with Down syndrome is actually partially impaired due to a variety of factors. So that goes back to the impaired muscle tone when you're a child and the development of it all, and then too little or too much flexibility. So the important thing to notice here is that people with Down syndrome, it's a lot more harder for them to gain back control when they do become off balance. So when you're standing on a beam or you're just walking in general and you become off balance, people with Down syndrome, unlike us, it's a lot harder for them to gain back their center of pressure and center of balance and continue on. Rather, you see an increased fall risk and trouble conducting everyday tasks. Going back to the whole going up the stairs, it's a lot more harder for them to lean forward and continue to move forward without falling. So just another quick note before I get into the experimental design of it all is that, so dorsiflexion, when it comes to the ankle, is when you're bringing your foot up, and plantar flexion is when you push your foot down towards the ground. I'm going to be using those two words a lot, so just wanted to clarify. Now, when testing how strong the soleus muscle is, I conducted a number of tests, but I used the Isokinetic Dynamometer. The Isokinetic Dynamometer, I'll get a little bit more into the explanation of it all, but I looked at the range of motion for the ankle. So for this, I had them already sitting in the chair, and I would use a goniometer. Goniometer just simply tests exactly what angle you're at dorsiflexion, what angle you're at in plantar flexion. And then in order to calculate the ankle range of motion, I would just simply calculate the difference in between, and then I would compare that to individuals without Down syndrome to get a better idea of how having a tightened soleus muscle affects your ankle range of motion, whether or not it's less flexible in comparison to your average adult without Down syndrome, and just get a better idea as to all of it. And now I would use the isokinetic dynamometer itself to test the peak torque values exerted during plantar and dorsiflexion. So the isokinetic dynamometer checks the movement and how fast you're able to move. And then I compare that to the balance results. Now, the balance assessment, I conducted a Berg balance test to test the fall risk of individuals and exactly how well they're able to conduct everyday tasks. So I would use the force plate to test postural sway. So the force plate is the piece of data that would give you much more specific and detailed data as to all of it. And the Berg balance was just a little bit more conclusive overall analysis of how good your balance is, what you're able to do and what you're able not to do. And then I would compare the two in order to get a better idea of, so if you have a strong plantar dorsiflexion in the isokinetic dynamometer and you also have good balance, how there's any correlation, and then also if there's any correlation between if you have very low torque values, you're not having a very strong ankle flexion, and then having a bad balance, and then seeing exactly what activities you're not able to do, where you're leaning more if you have a lower torque value when it comes to your ankle, and then just overall idea of it all. So force play was a lot more specific. I would use that to get a more cohesive idea of your balance, and then same with the Berg balance test to get an idea of what activities you're able to do, what you're not able to do. And then the isokinetic dynamometer would just give me a overall conclusive idea of how strong, how much force they're able to exert, and then see if that's any different in people with Down syndrome and people without Down syndrome. So seeing if people with a tightened soleus muscle have it any more weaker, or if people with without Down syndrome where they don't have a tightened soleus muscle, it's a little bit stronger, or if there's a difference there at all. And then comparing also the balance values to people without Down syndrome as well. So now to get into the bulk of it all, so isokinetic dynamometer testing, as you can see, this is the isokinetic dynamometer. I would have people sit at an angle with their knee in order to maximize the amount of torque that they could exert. And then obviously I would have people wear shoes unlike the second photo, and it would line up with the ankle, which is that little star right there. And then I would have them push down and pull back up. So the isokinetic dynamometer itself just tests how much torque you're exerting when the machine itself is moving for you, and then also it helps measure what your response time is when the machine is moving and then it goes back up. So it just measures the range of motion when you're in plantar and dorsiflexion. And so I did a warm-up speed of 90 degrees per second, and then I did 3 trials for each speed. So when I say trial, or I had 3 different movements basically. So I had one whole movement is from plantar all the way up to Dorsi, and then I would have them do that 3 more times, and then I did that for 3 speeds, and this is the data in which I actually accumulated. So 30 degrees per second, 60 degrees per second, 120 degrees per second. And then obviously I use the elevated knee, but the important thing about the isokinetic dynamometer is no matter how much force you're going to be exerting, it's not going to be moving at a faster speed. Rather, it moves at the same exact speed, but the isokinetic dynamometer only really tests exactly how much force you're exerting and how well you're responding to when the machine itself is moving. So just another quick note. So dorsiflexion is pulling up, plantar flexion is pulling down. Now I'll look at about the isokinetic dynamometer test. So if you have a look at this right here, you can see that torque is on the left. Torque is actually going to be measured in the green line right there. And you can see that all the little small humps on the graph, those are all my Dorsi values. So this is actually a picture of mine when I was first learning how to do the isokinetic dynamometer test. And then the higher ones are plantar. So my trend in me was I had greater plantar, so I was able to push down for harder and pull back up with less torque. And then position in degrees is measured in the blue line, and whatever it gets zeros out, that just means that I'm back at the position where the ankle is supposed to be. So at the equilibrium basically. And now my isokinetic dynamometer data. This is the data in which I collected for all my participants at all the different speeds. Now the ranges of torque. So I had greater torque values for dorsiflexion in my test group. So what that basically just means is if you look at the graph right here, it shows that I had more individuals with a torque value when it comes to Dorsi, torque values greater than 20 newtons per meter. And then I had more individuals in the range of less than 10 newtons per meter when it came to plantar flexion. So that just means that the overall average for Dorsi and plantar, Dorsi had a greater average for torque in newtons per meter in comparison to plantar. So that just hints towards an idea of what the overall trend is within my experimental group. Now, a comparison between plantar Dorsi strength compared to the average population. When I'm talking about the average population, I basically just mean people without Down syndrome. So I got this study, from a paper in a study with about 50 participants and from about the same age range, so 15 to 40 years old, and it would test exactly what their plantar and dorsiflexion is. And I compared that trend to people in my experimental group. So as you can see, the trend with people without Down syndrome tends to be that they have greater plantar than Dorsi. My trend, however, with people with Down syndrome is greater Dorsi in comparison to plantar. So that hints at an idea that you have people with Down syndrome are able to pull back up with their foot with greater strength, but they can't pull up or they can't push down as much. So that means that like leaning forward, very difficult for them. It's a lot harder. And then also it's a very noticeable difference in the amount of torque being exerted overall. So you can see that the number for plantar average and number in plantar and Down syndrome is almost 10 times that of the individual with Down syndrome's average. So this is a graph showing the peak torque in individuals with Down syndrome. So even in the non-athletic individuals without Down syndrome in the average population, you still have the general trend that plantar flexion is consistently greater in comparison to the Dorsi. And so that just hints towards the fact that they're able to push off with greater force in comparison to people with Down syndrome, even when you're not athletic. So it's not just a small, minute group of athletes that have greater plantar. It's the overall trend with people without Down syndrome. Now, ankle range of motion in tested individuals. Now, this is within my participants with my experimental testing. And so I had some people ranging from about 4 degrees range of motion. So that just means from their Dorsi to their plantar, they were only able to move about 4 degrees. And then the majority of my participants were in the range of 20 to 50 degrees. So not too bad. Actually, it was quite good values. So now into the balance assessments of it all. So this is for the force plate. The force plate, I did 4 trials. So 2 with a firm surface, 1 eyes open, 1 eyes closed, and then 2 with a foam surface in which I would put a little tiny foam spongy thing on top of the force plate in order to elevate them and get a better idea of what they feel like when they're not on a firm surface with their eyes open and their eyes closed. So on the right, you can see a little graph in which you see the line and the squirrely all over the place. So that just means the movement of the center of pressure on the force plate. So as they're standing there, you can obviously see that the red line means that they have a much lower displacement when they have their eyes open in comparison to when they have their eyes closed, which is the blue. So it just overall measures how much you're moving away from your center of pressure and overall moving around. Now, AP and ML directions. So the AP means, I'm going to be referring to this when I'm talking about the excursion values for the force plate. And so AP just means anterior and posterior. And then ML just means medial lateral. So that just means when you're moving side to side. So anterior, posterior, when you're moving forward and backwards. And then medial lateral is when you're moving side to side. So I'm just going to be talking about those directions when it comes to the excursion values. And so here we go. This is the big bulk of data that I got for the force plate. And at first I tried testing and figuring out what the formula is for center of pressure. I did a number of calculations for that, but overall those just were non-conclusive with the amount of people and participants that I had, which were only 13 here. So I ended up just using the excursion, AP, and ML values, which basically just tells me how much they're moving away from their center of pressure, how much their displacement is, and how much they're relying on one more side than the other. So ML, most of the time, the medial lateral values only will be different if you're relying on one more leg than the other. So if you're leaning on your left leg more than the other, you're going to have a greater ML value. But anterior posteriorly was a lot greater than ML actually. So that means that individuals in my test group tend to lean forward and backward a lot more than when they move side to side. So that actually tends to be a problem. But when you think about it, leaning forward and backward actually isolates the ankle muscles. So that tends to be more relevant when it comes to having a weakened ankle muscle. So that's why the force plate actually was very conclusive and very interesting to me. The Berg balance test conducts about an idea of how well they're able to do everyday activities. So there was about 14 everyday activities and you rank them out of 4. So 4 means you're super independent, you're able to do them all on your own. And then 0 means you have to have assistance, you need help and you need help requiring it. So into my scores, a lot of my individuals scored quite well. They all scored higher than a 46, which is really well. But I only had 2 individuals that got a perfect 56, whereas most individuals without Down syndrome tend to consistently get a 56. So that hints towards an idea that a lot of them still require assistance when it comes to doing some activities. I had 2 participants that actually had a moderate fall risk, which means that they have an increased chance of falling. So an analysis, peak torque for plantar and dorsiflexion. A majority of individuals had higher dorsiflexion within my experimental group with Down syndrome in comparison to the consistently relevant higher plantar flexion than Dorsi in people without Down syndrome. So that just hints to the idea that because of this different relation and also the different and decreased amount of torque that they're exerting with people with Down syndrome, that's going to be affecting their soleus muscle is obviously weaker and they're able to push down with a less force, and there's a difference between higher dorsi and lower plantar when it comes to people with Down syndrome. So it's the opposite trend there. And then the ankle range of motion is, for typical healthy adults, it's 20 to 50 degrees. My participants range from 4 to 78, showing that there's not a great difference there, but there's some people that only can move their ankle 4 degrees. So now how does this affect balance, and then why does it matter? So low Berg balance scores means that they need more assistance when it comes to doing everyday tasks, having a greater excursion on the AP directions. So the anterior posterior means that it's harder for them to get back to their center of pressure, and that they're moving forward, they're moving back more, and they have an increased fall risk, and that obviously shows within the Berg balance test. And so some analysis of possible errors is the time for my participants to respond to the Isokinetic Dynamometer moving incompletely is a lot more slowed. So that might be the reason as to why I had different results, but also, so it notes the fact that individuals with Down syndrome tended to continue to push down even when the machine would push back up. So they weren't feeling, their ankle wasn't able to respond back in time. That's maybe why they had a different in values, and it just hints towards a cognitive impairment. But what I learned works best is using a goniometer test before and being able to get better results. So how I can apply these is I can use specifically targeted exercises for the soleus muscle to help improve balance, and then have more experiments testing the relevance of plantar flexion to balance, which may be conducted. So physical therapists can use this in order to get a better idea of what exercises to pinpoint to help people with Down syndrome be able to do everyday activities. So conclusion, in individuals with Down syndrome, they have slowed response time for their calf muscles, they have a weaker soleus muscle, they exert less force, they have a greater chance of fall risk, and their trend is unlike that of people without Down syndrome. So because of that, they have worse postural sway. It's harder for them to regain their own balance. So thank you to my on-site faculty advisor, Dr. Georgi, and Dr. Halsopfel, and thank you to my college counselors, and thank you to Superior. And there's my works cited. Awesome.